Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I think we can start with our round table. We have been named in the program as round table, so we have a special status in the framework of the conference. I understand that we have a special rights also to speak about the real things and about the name the phenomena as with the name they deserve. So we will be speaking about the values after the crisis. I would say I would add it during the crisis and maybe even before the crisis. I understand that organizers gave us kind of freedom. We are not bound as with any political mandate. We are the people who are working mostly in the civil society area, and I understood also from the biographies of distinguished colleagues who will participate in this debate that they are not only thinker in the field of values, but they are promoters as well and organizers of the events which aim to promote the values in the function of bringing the people together, nation together, and to make the world based on better values than the daily politics is. I think that I listened to some of the panels in this forum. I have to join everybody who congratulate the organizers for excellent organization of this forum and for a broad spectrum of ideas which have been presented here. I'm afraid that our keyword, values, are very often abused by the politicians who want to say, okay, let's hope that the values, different values will prevail, and so we can act as we did always, and we can just continue we can pursue the politics with the same aims and the same methods as we did so far. So I hope that we will put some light on the real values, or some of the real values which can change the politic and be less alibi for not changing the perceptions. I hate to make the debate more interesting by telling a joke, but I cannot resist to do exactly this, what I hate. And the joke is as follows. There were a couple of people in jail, and somebody was brought as a newcomer, and he saw that they amused themselves by calling the numbers. So 5, somebody said, and everybody was laughing. And then somebody said, then the other guy said 8, and everybody was laughing, enjoying, being happy. And then the newcomer tried to say the same, tried how it works, and he said 15, and nobody was laughing. Everybody serious, and he said, why the hell are they not laughing? They said, well, you know, 15. It's such an old joke. Nobody cares really for it. Nobody smiles to this joke. So I said, well, maybe it would be a good idea to recall some names also in the framework of the debate we are having here and today and yesterday, and call the names like Yalta, Potsdam, Rome, Doha, Kyoto, Lisbon, Bretton Woods, Schengen, for instance. There are some other names which have specific meaning, and we can either smile or be sad or depressive, but a lot of attempts have been done in the politics in the last 50 years in order to bring the values and different perspectives and different perceptions. And we stay where we stay, and the names are forgotten. And I remember, if I may say, I heard yesterday, I think that it was Turkish Minister for Foreign Affairs, who spoke about the necessity to understand better those who have nots in the world, and who about the problem between the developed and underdeveloped world, etc. I remember when I was a journalist, young journalist in 70s in Bonn, Germany, and it was the time of the great ideas of Willy Brandt, North-South dialogue, and there were some benchmarks set how we can improve and how we can solve this problem. And I think, and I see the world now worse than it was at that time. And the problem which we are facing now, which we are actually feeling only when a new boat lands at the Italian ports or Sicily with the people who are looking for the better fortune and better deal in the world. So it actually, the values have been already named, called, they are well known, but the problem is we don't care really very much for them, and therefore this maybe and hopefully that these crises, I hope it will not be such an easy task to come out of this crisis as I heard in the previous debate in this room, namely that the crises are shorter and shorter. So if this would be true and as simple, then probably we would not sit here and look for more complicated answers for very complicated questions. So I intended to say these couple of words as introduction. I also noticed that everybody at this table, we have quite similar CVs. All of us, we were working in different civil society organizations, in the press, media, and organizations who try to bring the people together. I intend to pass the word to our friend from Finland, Dr. Raimo Verinen, with a very specific reason. I used to be ambassador of Slovenia, the first ambassador of Slovenia in 1992 in Finland, which means that I was there also in the time of the biggest major economic crisis, the biggest one which Finland has ever seen, I would guess. And I saw at that time also some very sad pictures on the street. The Red Cross helped the people to provide them with the daily food. And we know Finland now as an example of modern society. It's more than only Nokia, there are other things there. But what intrigued me is that Dr. Verinen, he was also working in the Academy of Finland. And I would like to hear from you, Dr. Verinen, how and why did you in Finland manage the crisis on the way as you did, and if there is anything valuable which we can think about and which we can also use in the time where we are facing a major economic and social crisis in the world. So it would be very, very interesting to listen some of your experiences at that time. Please, the floor.
I think my answer is made easier by the fact that a few weeks ago, Seppo Honkapohja, my former colleague, who also was a professor of economics at Cambridge, as non-executive director at the Bank of Finland, published a book with 3 of his colleagues called The Recovery Recaptured, which came out from MIT Press. So it tells the full story of what happened, and therefore I can be rather brief. But what happened in Finland in early 1990s is that we lost 13% of GDP in 3 years. The crisis was probably deeper than the present one. The main reason perhaps was that the capital account was liberalized in 1986, and the institutions like bank supervision wasn't up to the task. So we developed a public economy, high real estate prices, investment in golf courses, and so on and so forth. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, we had been exporting 10 to 12% of our exports at that time to the Soviet market. And there was an economic downturn in US and Britain as well. So the bubble exploded, and the result was, as I said, the steep decline in the economy, almost 20% unemployment. And what helped, however, that the external debt only accounted 10 to 15% of GDP at that time. So there was space for borrowing from abroad. But yes, there were rather deep effects in society. What, and to answer your specific question, what helped, I think, were 2 or 3 things. There was, as an antidote to economic downturn, heavy investment in science and technology. Now the R&D budget accounts for 3.5% of GDP, which is among the highest figures in the world. But 2/3 of that come from the private sector, and 1/2 of the private sector comes from Nokia. So Nokia certainly is an opportunity, but it also creates vulnerabilities. Increase in productivity, economic restructuring, investment in science and technology, I think, were the keys for the recovery. If there is a lesson, a warning example from Finland, is that in the present crisis, one shouldn't let unemployment to become chronic. Long-term unemployment, in particular among the youth, creates a section in society which remains unintegrated. We lose the labor power of those people. We get social problems. So keep the people employed, even there is a deficit in the budget. And in particular, avoid the long-term unemployment among the youth. So that might be a social lesson that one may have to learn from the Finnish crisis in the early 1990s.
Thank you very much, and I think we will probably turn back to this challenge or this good practice of Finland, maybe in the discussion. But now, as I gave you the word, and you said, Dr. Veren, that you were prepared to talk about something else, please, the floor is again yours.
Were based on ample supply of money, low interest rates, and the opening up of international economic relations. It created, as some economists said, a Goldilocks economy that was expected to help everyone. But of course, the distribution of economic benefits of globalization, the 10-year growth period, were uneven. On the positive side, one may note that the poverty rates in the world have, have been declining, in particular in China and in a few other countries. On the other hand, poverty, whether it's $1 or $2 per day limit that we use, still is pervasive in South Asia, Africa, maybe Central Asia. But the reduction in poverty, I think, can be attributed to economic globalization, opening up of the world economy. On the other hand, there's a lot of evidence that inequalities within countries have been growing. They have been growing in China, in Russia, in Brazil. They are among the highest in the world. In the countries of Anglo-Saxon capitalism, income inequalities are much higher than in continental economies, and so on and so forth. So the dilemma we have in hands, in a sense, as a result of globalization, which has been serving well open, export-oriented economies, is that do we have a trade-off between poverty reduction and increase in inequality? Because they don't need to move in the same direction. We can have, as we have in China, a situation where those two tendencies live together or exist together. And the question arises, are we then forced to make a choice, either to reduce poverty and accept the increase in income inequality, or is it possible to reconcile those two objectives with each other? And it may not be easy, in particular in the rapidly growing economies. Both interregional and social inequities in the allocation of resources tend to grow. But it may be that in particular smaller countries, it's possible to reconcile those two objectives. And there, I don't want to advocate the so-called Nordic model too much, because it's not really representative of this world. But I think the Nordic countries have succeeded to combine the elimination of poverty with reasonably acceptable distribution of income. And I have a couple of other points, but I'll stop here in the interest of the debate. And just would like to emphasize that while globalization has been often criticized for all sorts of evils of this world, and it certainly has had negative consequences as well, it, after all, I think has been serving the world better than many people argue. And therefore, if the result of the current crisis is to turn the economies inside, whether by means of protectionism or nationalism or some other means, I think we are shooting ourselves at the foot. Thank you.
For both parts of your introductory statements, I think we will come in the debate to the question of poverty in the world and about the possibilities to have the lively working economy in the function of solving the problem of inequality between the parts of the world. I would now like to pass, in order to be just, I would like to pass the word to only lady participants in our panel. Madame Salpi Gazarian. She is American Armenian who moved back home, if I may say, to Armenia after the independence, after the country got independence. She has been involved with the Zorian Institute, used to be an editor and publisher of Armenian International Magazine and special assistant to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. She serves as director of the Yerevan-based Civilitas Foundation, which was established by Armenia's foreign minister at that time, Vartan Oskanyan. She served as his special assistant of the foreign ministry for 8 years. She has been an editor, a publisher, and worked in the public non-profit sector. She moved to Armenia from United States, as I said, after the independence. These are a couple of words you added to my previous CV I had. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Coming to Slovenia on the plane, Financial Times, the weekend edition, had a great interview with economist Skidelsky, Britain. And he had a great line that I'm going to use, and I may get pelted for it, but I'm going to use it anyway, that economists don't like people. And, you know, with apologies for the shorthand and acknowledging that this is a generalization and it ignores those economists who, in fact, only work on issues of poverty and equalization. It seems to me that some of the observations that we've made about the cause of our present situation and possible ways to get out of it have in fact to do with the fact that we have focused, because the times were good, we have focused so much on counting, managing the tangibles over the intangibles. And that's what economists have been so visibly doing for so long, and documenting the relentless pursuit of wealth and profit and all of the things that, you know, have their place in the whole development process. And all of that was fine and acceptable so long as the numbers were moving up, not down, and were moving up fast enough and in large enough segments that things were in fact trickling down and poverty numbers were in fact being reduced, and it all looked fine. It all looked fine, and as one commentator said, it began to take on a form of a race car, a very fast and complex race car that was able to do things we couldn't quite understand. And again, it was fine because we were winning. And so the second part of this, the observation, carrying on with the race car metaphor, is that we let the race car do what it was doing, and all of the basic, simple things that we already knew in our lives, things about, like regulating everything from baby food to swimming pool depths to teaching licenses to car speeds, we didn't do for this speeding car. We, for some reason, assumed and allowed the public intellectuals to say what they kept saying even after the crisis was visible, and that we somehow assumed that the market would regulate itself. We haven't assumed that in our societies for many, many years in all of the other sectors that mattered. And we did assume that in that the economy would somehow, in fact, and the financiers and the economists would somehow, in fact, find ways to regulate themselves. And as it turned out, that isn't what they were doing. And that observation, coupled with the fact that globalization has in fact been very, very successful economically, that economic processes have in fact been globalized and political processes have not kept up with that internationalization, brought us to a point where if the American financiers were the ones who were, at least at the beginning, at the cause of this crisis, the result is that we are now sitting in Slovenia and talking about contracting European economies, not just American economies. In fact, greater contraction here in Europe than in the US. And the globalization that we wanted to work worked, but it worked economically. Politically, we kind of left it alone, and in our search for solutions to some of these dilemmas, that if we start from the back, that the internationalization of the political processes is going to have to take into consideration all of the different value systems. It will not be international unless we're all engaged. If we're all engaged, we are necessarily going to bring in different values. We just got through listening to the successful Finnish experiment of, in fact, trying to acceptably, equitably redistribute wealth. If you said that in a group of Americans, I don't know what would happen. So the process of internationalizing the solution will necessarily force us to reevaluate our values and listen to everybody else's, except that in the process, we probably are going to have to be very careful about distinguishing between values, traditions, and customs. You know, we take for granted that a custom, just because we do it that way, is the tradition, and the tradition is necessarily a value, and we defend it to death. And I'm not, the process of internationally dealing with the solution is going to force us, whether we like it or not, to sit around the table and look at the other set of values. The process of searching for solutions is also going to make us look at the regulatory process either in an old way or a new way. And I say an old way because, regulation worked. Self-regulation that we assumed would work and didn't in this case did work in the old days. It did work for doctors and lawyers and accountants. And, doctors did what they did for the common good, and attorneys to this day are considered officers of the court, and accountants not only audit you, but they call their colleague to audit them. And it really did start from a self-regulating process that went off the deep end when the benefits and that which was to be gained took on a different perspective. But I also think something else happened there, and that is that we do not allow self-regulation when the item at hand, the topic, the challenge at hand is something that very directly affects me, the citizen. My baby food, my airline seat, my doctor, my accountant. But when the topic is telecommunications, ownership of the airwaves, financial markets, derivatives, and all the stuff that we don't understand and don't personally engage with, we somehow allow government and governments and the elite to deal with regulating that. That doesn't always happen and clearly hasn't happened right. And the guideposts there are really very simple. If something is too good to be true, it probably is. If your gut tells you this is not going to work, it probably won't. If something is too big to let fail, then it probably is too big, period. The regulatory processes that are going to have to kick in will very probably follow the rules that the professions that had regulated themselves over the years had adopted. And finally, my friends, the economists, that all of the talk yesterday, and to some extent today, about the need to assure the soft security basket, that talk has taken place and is now institutionalized among the international institutions, the international political elite, and everybody accepts that when you're talking about security, you're also talking about economic security, and that the two are indistinguishable. I'm not sure the same is true of the other side, and that's the question, that in this process of trying to get ourselves out of this crisis, will we be able to bring the economists, the financiers, the economic elite establishment to also...
Very much. I would now pass the word to Mr. Richter, because I am intrigued by the intervention of the Chinese ambassador in previous panel, where he obviously showed concern that our answer, the answer of Western world and Western industrialized countries on the crisis might be increasingly protectionism. You are working, somehow in last couple of years spread between Davos and Beijing, and as president of Horatius, which is the independent international organization committed to enacting visions for a sustainable future. I read here that prior to founding Horatius, Dr. Richter was a director of the World Economic Forum. During his time, he has developed an extensive experience and knowledge on the world economic, business, and political scene and its key players. Under his leadership, the Forum summits in Asia and Asia's part of Davos have evolved to facilitate the exchange of expertise between leaders in business, government, and civil society. I am wondering if your experience in between these two partners, which now looks to be confronted in the clinch for the world market, and how to come out to have a better deal, better share after the crisis. How do you see now the prospect of enriching each other's philosophy of dealing with crisis, with growth, with the benefits of the capitalist system, which obviously everybody applies now, but with different results. Please.
Thanks so much, Ivo, for your kind introduction. Let me start to say that the current state of the world is quite gloomy. Whenever you open a newspaper, you read about crisis, you read about catastrophes, and you read about traders in banks who take huge benefits, even so the banks are almost bankrupt. And this reminds me of a philosopher called Machiavelli, who lived actually not far away from here in northern Italy in the 16th century. And he was basically saying that the end justifies the means. Basically, everything is possible. You can always find a culprit. You can always point your finger. And it's exactly what's happening right now, ladies and gentlemen. We always point fingers. We always say it's not our crisis, it's somebody else's crisis. The bankers, maybe the Americans, it's New York, it's London. The Asians talk about the West talks about Asia, always in a negative way. We talk about the demise of the so-called Anglo-Saxon system, which governed the world, which is very much based on a short-term approach to capitalism. Whereas, and it's your question, Ivo, you talked about the Asian approach, or the Asian value-rated approach, where we have thinkers like Confucius, who proclaim that we should have a long-term approach based on principles, and not just reaping short-term benefits. But coming back to the crisis and the question of values, whenever we have a crisis, maybe that's also what you talked about before, about the crisis in Finland, we always go for a search for values. It happened during the Finnish crisis, it happened during the so-called .com crisis a couple of years ago, the internet crisis. And we talk about the search for new values. And maybe a year after that, after this debate, we forget values again and we start in the old well-oiled machine of capitalism. There's not much change happening. So what about values in general? Maybe I should quote another philosopher. His name is Thomas Locke, who lived in the UK, who was saying that homo homini lupus, the man is man's wolf. Basically had a very negative view of human mankind, because he was saying that man, by definition, is bad. Whatever you do, whatever values you have, you can't change him. I think he's wrong. I'm quite optimistic and positive about human mankind. In principle, I think we are good. It's just maybe the environment and the circumstances changing us. What means basically we need a framework of values governing us, governing our relationships, governing the living together of human mankind. And it's not truly a European approach. It's not only Plato and the Greek philosophers saying this, but it's also our Asian friends. If you take Confucius, if you take the great thinkers of India and the Arab world, the Quran itself is saying that we should love each other. And basically, when it comes to values, the question is, what kind of values do we need? And I think it all comes to one singular, most important value, is a respect for each other, or call it love for each other. And I think in all great philosophies, starting from the Greek, the Egyptians, to nowadays philosophers, we always focus, or we should focus, on this value of respect for each other. What does it mean in our current situation of economic crisis? I think we should abandon the so-called pure Anglo-Saxon approach, where we reap short-term benefits, where we maybe might even want to lay off people to push our share price of large corporations. And we should go maybe for a more Asian approach. You're right, Ivo, a more Asian approach where we have a long-term vision and where we definitely have this respect for each other and we are not trying to manipulate the system. As a matter of fact, I believe, ladies and gentlemen, there are no regional values as such. I think there shouldn't be any kind of European values, Asian values. You remember the debate of Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir and the Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew around 15 years ago, calling for Asian values, basically saying that Asians are much better in terms of providing long-term benefits to their respective societies because they're not as greedy as we are in the West. I believe we should talk about universal values, irrespective where we are, in Europe, North America, or in Asia. Universal values based on principled governance. We need principles governing our world, and the main most important principle is what I called before the respect for each other. So if we apply those generally respected values, I think we can find a way out of this crisis. So we need more of a dialogue like here today, in the search for those universal values, and where we can again base our economic dealings or political dealings based on a true value system based on trust and respect for each other. Thank you.
Well, you mentioned the value of dialogue and dialogue between the cultures, and I think this is the time to include our friend Mr. André Claret, who is Executive Director of the Anna Lindh Foundation for Dialogue Between Cultures, an institution of the Union for Mediterranean created to promote people-to-people cooperation and dialogue in the Euro-Mediterranean region. I would mention from your biography here just a couple of points. Mr. Claret headed the European Institute for Mediterranean during 5 years. During his mandate, this institute became a relevant institution of Euro-Mediterranean civil society as a think tank, an actor of cultural dialogue and promoter of partnership in the area. I also saw in your biography from previous years that you has been as a journalist as I did, and he has been a director of the Spanish news agency EFE for Sub-Saharan Africa and Central America, where he covered the regional wars at the end of the 80s and the democratization of Panama, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. He was director of EFE's news agency for Catalonia, when Barcelona held the Olympic Games in '92. During the transition of Spain from dictatorship to democracy, he collaborated in some of the most important media of that country. He was a deputy editor of El Mundo and La Calle, two magazines who played an important role in the early years of the Spanish democracy. So, excuse me if I didn't mention some of the parts of your activity which you consider even more interesting, but I would like to give you the floor, and I assume that you will talk about cultural dialogue in the function of overcoming the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As you remembered, I have been a journalist during part of my life, and a journalist prefers always to write than to speak. So I wrote just a couple of 3 pages for my introductory speech, and then I will participate in the debate. Spanish banker, one of the most important Spanish bankers, Francisco González, said last year that the financial crisis had been provoked in a certain way, he said, by a crisis of values which preceded the crisis in the economy. Supported by a banker, this statement has an added value for our debate. In fact, this relation between values, politics, governance, and the economy is nothing new. But maybe the question of values is now more relevant. Maybe we need more than a new Keynes and more than another Bretton Woods to find the way out of that situation. In my short speech, I will try to explain why that crisis is different and why the question of social and cultural values matters in the development of the crisis, as the banker said, and why values will matter more than in precedent crises in the finding of a sustainable solution. In fact, we know from history, and particularly from Western history, that the financial crisis provokes always in the societies affected a defensive and protective reaction. It sparks a wave of fear in the society and facilitates a tendency to look backwards for solving the problems of tomorrow. Protectionism in politics, in economics, populism in politics, and social exclusion are some of the manifestations of such a reaction. The crisis doesn't affect only jobs and savings. It can also have a devastating impact on the system of ideas and values which are the intellectual and moral basement of any society. According to Eurostat, a third of the Europeans live now in a situation of great uncertainty in terms of jobs and social expectations. More than a half if we look at youth. It means that the social elevator, which has been essential to explain European prosperity, is in part out of order. And the European model, based in the idea of progress, social solidarity and cohesion, has lost most of its magnetism for many Europeans, particularly for youth. One of the consequences of such a crisis in the field of ideas is the propensity to go back to the past with a certain nostalgia. The past is dreamed as a source of legitimacy, and the future is perceived as the font of anger and threats. The other manifestation of such an intellectual and social climate is the need to identify responsibilities, and the more the people to blame are alien to our tradition, to the old good times, the better. It's a process, the treacherous process of demonizing the other, an other which can be real or symbolic, living around the corner or coming from abroad. It can be the Arab, it can be the Jew, it can be the Gypsy. During the last meeting of the Alliance of Civilizations in Istanbul, President Danilo Türk passed on some of the dangers of the financial crisis represents for our system of values, in terms which deserve to be quoted. The current crisis, he said, affects the basic values upon which different societies are founded, and basic questions of social development are raised again. The Slovenian president raised some of the questions which need an answer if we want to avoid the danger of a social regression and to preserve social cohesion. I quote him again. He said, how to address the needs of the most vulnerable, including ethnic minorities and immigrant communities, how to address the public opinion, particularly in those countries where discontent may turn into new types of prejudice, xenophobia, and incitement to ethnic hatred, how to govern cultural diversity, end of the quote. The answer to those questions must take into account some particularities of the current crisis and the international context. Let me mention, just to finish, a couple of issues which are of utmost importance. The first idea I suggest for the debate is that cultural diversity is much more relevant now than it has never been in the past. In most of the European countries, the human landscape is dramatically different than the one they had during the Great Depression of the 30s, even during the economic crisis of the 70s. Diversity is a reality, and diversity will increase because globalization and because of the demographic trends. The challenge is how to avoid the tendency to identify diversity as a threat and how to make pedagogy about the need to leverage that diversity to give a solution to our economic concerns. The second and last idea I want to share with you is that cultural identity matters much more now than in the past. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, cultural identities and cultural dialogue have turned out to be part of most of the diplomatic agendas. The launching of the Barcelona process in 1995 was one of the first expressions of that new thinking, with a third basket devoted, as you know, to cultural dialogue. Cultural dialogue will be also essential for the shaping of the new global order, as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Turkey underlined yesterday. President Obama assumed this challenge better than any other Western leader in his speech at Cairo's university, referring to the most challenging and crucial of all the cultural misunderstandings, the one which exists between the West and the Islamic world. Let me say, to finish, that for Europe, the meeting point of that historical and needed dialogue is the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is and will remain the origin of our social diversity. It is also a source of conflicts and threats, of course, as it has been said in other panels of that forum. But the Mediterranean is also part of the solution. The idea was essential for the launching of the Barcelona process and more recently for the establishment of the Union for the Mediterranean. The financial crisis makes more urgent and vital to consolidate that process of association, giving it a new impulse and a broader vision, something which cannot be done without the mutual agreement on a set of common values which must be based, of course, on human rights, mutual respect, dialogue and persuasion. Europe faces the danger of exiting the crisis having lost economic weight and political influence. It is the syndrome of what Farid Zakaria, the editor of Newsweek, called recently the rise of the rest. To face that syndrome, the neighbours of the southern shore of the Mediterranean are an opportunity for the Europeans. They may give us the necessary critical mass to face the rising of new global players. This is why preserving and consolidating the values of openness, hospitality and dialogue in the current times of crisis is so important. Many speakers have pointed out during the forum that the current crisis may be an opportunity for Europe. It is an opportunity to match its vital and strategic interest with the reinforcement and the rethinking of the values which are at the heart of the European project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I will now pass the word to Mr. Dimitros Katsoudas, the central figure of our panel, but the last in the row. I would like to say a couple of words. Mr. Dimitros Katsoudas is the Secretary General of European Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Hellenic Republic. He studied law in Athens and political science in Great Britain. Between 1977 and 91, he worked for the Greece's most prominent liberal think tank, the Center for Political Research and Information, in which he eventually became Director General and Editor-in-Chief of the Center's political journal Epicentra. Mr. Katsoudas was gradually introduced on the more typical political agenda. In the early 90s, advisor to the Prime Minister of Greece, Kostas Mitsotakis. In 91, he was appointed Greece's first Secretary General for Forest and the Natural Environment. From 94 and 96, consultant to New Democracy Parliamentary Group. Since then, he served as political advisor to Mrs. Dora Bakoyannis. We learned this lady during the Olympic Games in Athens, and she is now the incumbent Minister for Foreign Affairs. So, Mr. Katsoudas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I would like to start with a rather optimistic note concerning the world crisis, which unfortunately is Greek. We have been in some sort of crisis in my country, at least so the press insists, for the last 3,200 years, and we are still here. So we should not be too desperate about crisis. Now, there is a second point I would like to make about values. The universality of values is something that is usually defined after they have been created. Let us take the very simple example of democracy. Democracy was just but one system applied at the time. I must remind you that monarchy, tyranny, oligarchy, aristocracy are also Greek words, and they were in operation in other cities when democracy was in operation in some of them. So the values, different and opposing values, coexisted even in such small geographical and national frontiers as one nation. And the situation is very much the same today. We had yesterday a brilliant speech by the foreign minister of Turkey, and it was obvious from that speech that this country is in an interesting process of transformation, accepting multiculturalism, and etc., etc. And there was talk of Istanbul becoming again a multicultural city. But we have to remember that just a few decades ago, a multicultural city, which was Istanbul, became a purely Turkish city because of Turkish policies at the time. So you see that the framework of creating crisis and applying principles varies tremendously. Now, let me try and single out some of the characteristics of this crisis. First, the paradox. We're talking of crisis of economic and financial systems at the time when there was the widest ever convergence in economic and political thinking, particularly in economic thinking. Take Europe, but also the North America and other parts of the world, where the center-right and center-left parties, European Socialist Party, Social Democrats, Conservatives, more or less have converged for the last couple of decades in their economic policies. So the first paradox is that the crisis occurs at a period in which there seemed to be no major contesting of the prevailing economical thinking. This is why I believe that we should not rush into conclusions as to what are the true theoretical causes of the crisis. There is talk of liberalism and talk of Keynesianism, but I think the two theories coexist. The crisis in America, the housing loans given abundantly to banks were encouraged by the state, after all. Even in the United States, which is the least statist society. And I don't think Europe ever abandoned its dosage of free market and the social dimension. And this is actually what we advertise as the European model. Now a second observation, except this paradox, is that the European political thinking and the European social model, as well as European politics, or the Western model, was by far the most aggressive historically. Each one of our nations in Europe, those who had the capacity historically at some periods of time, were infinitely more aggressive than Asian nations. Take, for example, Greece, Rome, Germany, Italy, Britain, France, Holland, Belgium, Spain, Portugal. Some of our nations were small, but their appetite was immense. We built empires as far as India. We built empires all over the world. And then the principles, the talk of principles as global principles today is talk of applying our principles. When we speak of democracy prevailing, human rights prevailing, whatever is the basic agenda is still the Western agenda. I don't think we fully take cognizance of the values of other societies in Europe. And the last, last remark is that sometimes inside our societies, the way they are organized reflects the crisis. For example, this is, as all speakers emphasized, a financial crisis of plastic money, over lending, etc., became an economic crisis in most countries, and then also a social crisis as a consequence of the economic crisis. But then societies react in different ways. I'll give you an example from my society, from our society in Greece. The Greek mentality, and I don't expect this is not exclusively Greek phenomenon, is sharply divided between the mentality prevailing inside the country, which is statist. That is, people aim at finding a position in the state apparatus, etc., for security. And then you see the same people the same Greeks, going outside the country and liberating their capacity to create. And this is why today, while Greece is probably the pre-last member of the old EU, it's 13th, I think, in the level of economic development among the 27, which is not a very satisfactory performance. But outside the country, you have the Greeks owning the largest merchant fleet in the world, which accounts for 52% of the tonnage of the entire EU. And the question rises, what is it that makes the same people effective outside the borders and ineffective inside? It is the question of values. When they're outside, they adopt the values of competitiveness, creativity, etc. When they're inside, they adopt the values of preservation of what they have and a conservative outlook to life. So therefore, in order to conclude, I would say two or these three things very hastily. First, we shouldn't be too hasty in evaluating the economic system, because the basic principles guiding our economic system were not unsound. B, it is definitely a case of examining the global financial institutions and the way they operate. C, it's time to re-estimate values in the sense of accepting a set of values that may not be ours, as I indicated before. And I would like to end with a remark on the EU, as I am responsible for our relations with the EU. I must say that the EU has been a very positive soft power, not only vis-à-vis the world, but also inside. Remember the situation, Spain and Portugal had dictatorships of 50 years duration, and no one could ever think now in these countries of re-establishing a dictatorship. Greece had a dictatorship 7 years, and no one would think of re-establishing a dictatorship. It's also a matter of enhancing the orientation of our economy vis-à-vis fields which were not being given attention before. The environment, social work. And this is the recipe, I believe, for getting out of this crisis. Realizing the new agenda that we need, new types of labor, new types of markets that we should develop while reorganizing economic institutions. I think the current crisis can thus serve as a major test for renewing both the values of European society and its efficiency. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I would like now to thank collectively to all panelists and give them the chance to maybe for some reaction or interaction on what the other colleagues and members said. Professor Väyrynen, please. I owe the public also a couple of data more about your, excuse me, CV. I have it. You are the only person which I did not sufficiently.
Well, why can't we save time?
Can you please do it yourself?
Save time and skip over the details and continue the debate rather, if that's all right, Mr. Chair.
Please.
Okay. One issue that several other colleagues touched upon here, but perhaps not explicitly, is that are we in the turning point right now? Every time there is a crisis, there are those prophecies that there's the end of an era, the beginning of a new one, which we don't know yet. Are we in such a turning point? I doubt. It may be that a really serious, deep changes in international relations, in both values and interests, require a major war. Unfortunately, there is no risk of major war ahead of us. What we probably are seeing is some kind of a continuing gradual transformation where certain interests and values are gaining ground over a, say, medium and longer period of time. And this, I think, is reflected in the structure of the international financial institutions, for instance. It's actually quite remarkable that in the G20 summit in London, one of the main decisions was to recapitalize IMF, which International Monetary Fund, which only a few years ago was considered a defunct organization. Now this capital base will be expanded, tripled to $750 billion. And in fact, IMF is used to rescue economies like in Iceland, Latvia, Ukraine, and so on and so forth. And to finish, one sign of changing power relations gradually is this talk about new international currency, which the head of the Chinese central bank started, which then appeared on the agenda of the so-called BRIC summit in Yekaterinburg, so that the dollars would be replaced by new international currency. Well, few people believe that this will happen anytime soon. I mean, we don't have any global or world central bank. The technical problems in such a transition would be monstrous. But still we are talking about replacing gradually dollar, maybe by special drawing rights, the IMF currency, which will be now growing in importance as a result of investment in IMF. But even if the current 500 billion extra dollars is allocated to IMF, the share of the special drawing rights, SDRs, of the total global currency pool will be about 5%. So you don't build world currency on 5% of the resources. But still these demands are symptomatic of the change we are witnessing.
Thank you very much, Professor Verinen. I found your CV, and I owe to our public a couple of dates more, rather than to say that you are the director of the Finnish Institute for International Affairs. He served as a tenured professor of political science and the director of the John B. Kroc Institute of International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame in the United States, and as a visiting professor of Princeton, Harvard, Minnesota Universities, and MIT. At least this, I would say, is important to know about you, and that you have been the president of Academy of Finland. So I saw Mr. Richter. You wanted to react also?
Yeah, I have three quick points, which are rather comments and concluding points. The first point is what Dimitris told us before. We shouldn't teach others about values. I think it's a very important point. We should go for universal values, but we shouldn't teach each other and say, impose our own culture on anybody else. But we should live on diversity and allow different opinions and try to create something new out of it. Second point is quite related to it. It's the issue of migration. And several speakers touched upon migration before. I think migration is really a source of creativity, of innovation, of entrepreneurship. See all the Chinese, the Indian entrepreneurs living in Chinatowns, in India towns around the world, in California or in Europe. So migration, I think it's good for economic activity, because migration is quite linked to creativity, because, as you said, people living outside their usual national background and culture have to deploy more entrepreneurship and creativity. And I think it's key also to revitalize us here in Europe and the European culture. The third point, again, it's based on long-term orientation. If you look into the usual election circus in Europe, usually we go for 4 years government in power. In the first year, governments come in and, of course, proclaim to change a lot, but usually adapt to the situation, and not much change is happening. And in the second year, maybe change is happening. In the third year, we're already rethinking and reflecting on the upcoming elections 2 years later. And in the fourth year, it's all about election campaign. So what I wanted to say with it is that we should give up this short-term orientation and really think long-term. And my call is on the next generation of leaders here in Europe who have long-term visions based on universal values. And just to finish this, if you go to Shanghai these days, there's a very new museum. It's called the Museum on the Future. In Europe, usually we put all very old things in our museums. It's all about the past. But I think we should think more about the future.
Thank you. Mr. Clary wanted to say?
Just a quick answer to that question, which is interesting. Are we at a turning point at the beginning of a new era or not? No? I think that we are, but not because the financial crisis, no? Because what happened before the financial crisis and has been pointed out by the crisis. No? I think that there are trends which are very, very important to be taken into account. No? First of all, what Zakaria called the rise of the rest. No? This is a big challenge for Europe. No? The rising of the new powers. No? It's a challenge in economic terms, and it's a challenge for our values. Yesterday, somebody took the floor and asked for what will happen with the values if the rest will become the main, the driven power in the future. No? And at the same time, the consequences of the fall of the Berlin Wall are not finished. No? Of course, the first consequence was democracy, which was very, very good, but the second one is the emergence of the cultural factor, which I have talked about in my speech. And then the emergence of a multipolar world, no? And I think for Europe, this is a very big challenge. This is a turning point. There are some forecasts. No? Europe is now more or less 18% of the world GDP. No? If nothing changes in the European policy, in 2030, Europe will be approximately 13% of the world GDP. It's a very big change for Europe. No, it's a danger of decline for Europe. No, and so what I think and what I try to say in my speech is that Europe must prepare to face that danger, that strategic question, and we have to prepare the European policy for a future which will be different after the economic crisis.
Thank you. Mrs. Salbi-Gazarian want to take the floor?
Let me see if I can go at this another way. One of the things that we do at the Civilitas Foundation in Yerevan is try to strengthen civil society by focusing on the need for collective thinking, collective action, and the collective good. And to do that in a society where Lenin and Stalin collectively delegitimized collective is a really hard task. And it seems to me, hearing this discussion, that the assumption of collective is more at the root of this discussion than a similar discussion in the United States would be, where collective doesn't exist, it's individual. And to a great extent, not just by its numbers, not just the economic engine is driven not just by the United States, not just because of its strength in numbers, but also because of its conceptual strength in entrepreneurship, enterprising spirit, and so forth. But something is happening here, and whether we're in the middle of this crisis or coming out of it, it really doesn't matter. At some point, a melding here is going to have to happen. And that is that if the US up until this point looked over at Europe and its socialist policies every now and then, and the welfare state concept, and just kind of thumbed its nose at it, the US now is taking actions that have surpassed Europe's efforts at supporting industry, the private sector, and so forth. And so changes are taking place, willingly or unwillingly, in the motor, the engine that is driving this process. And so if the IMFs and the rest are going to be bolstered, then perhaps this is also the time to invest more strongly the European assumptions of a collective good, a lifestyle that aims for different sets of priorities, where the intangibles still have maintained their value, where the process really goes a different direction, where quality of life remains quality of life and responsibility for collective lifestyle, with collective infrastructure and collective effects of poverty, inequality, and so forth are so much more immediately felt. This meld is going to have to take place, whether it takes place consciously and with a lot of European conceptual input, or unconsciously, it's going to take place.
Thank you. I would now like to pass the word from anybody to anybody from the public who wants to participate. Please, I saw two hands. Yes, please, gentlemen behind, and lady, second row.
Thank you very much for the word. Rand, I am a president of the Union Committee for NATO and a member of Euro-Atlantic Council Board of the Euro-Atlantic Council. I missed one topic which is related to the economic crisis and connected to demographic trends. This is particularly important for certain countries to observe maybe long-term effects of the economic, social, and other types of crises on the demographic trends, maybe in Europe or also elsewhere. So it is a typical problem which is related also to the values as well as to the material nature. And I would appreciate if distinguished panelists could devote a few words to this topic.
Thank you. Does anybody from the panelists want to take this topic, please?
Immigration was mentioned before by my colleague to the left, but there is something we must have in mind when discussing immigration. Immigration to societies which were inviting people to participate fully into their creative machine, like you mentioned the American values of enterprise. When we immigrated to the United States, it was to become primarily productive. If you examine the type of immigration that happens in Europe, it is usually to fill the lower gaps of the working machinery. There is a huge difference in that. And this is a huge difference between what America was doing with its immigrants and what we are doing with our immigrants. Every single study at the EU level shows that the assimilation of our immigrants in Europe differs naturally, but on the whole, it is not as satisfactory as the situation was, at least before what the Americans call the Hispanic arrival, at least until that stage of the American immigration process. Immigration also is a mix with the question of values, which was mentioned before. And then again, you have two different patterns in Europe. You have countries receiving immigrants or categories of immigrants who want to assimilate and others who don't. For example, in my country, we had a pure revolution in this respect. We were a country of immigrants, of immigration, and since 1990 we became one of the major receiving countries. Now, 1 in 10 inhabitants of Greece is an immigrant. Half of them are Albanian and the rest are from East Europe, etc. And now in this respect, I can speak from experience. The Albanians, being a neighboring nation, etc., tend to assimilate into society. Pakistanis, Somalians, Chinese, etc., tend to live in their own isolated communities in the heart of the city. So, if we wish to respect the particularities of these people, we shall have to examine what sort of acceptance they will have in our societies. Because if they don't wish to assimilate, not assimilate, I don't like the word assimilation, if they don't wish to integrate, is a much more correct expression. So the problem will be there. And I would like also to make a final remark, which doesn't have to do with immigration, but with the respect of the other, which was mentioned frequently. The situation with values is sometimes difficult to assess because of the different stages of development of various cultures. For example, we definitely live in what could call a post-Christian period in Europe, in the West, whereas parts of the Islamic world are at the peak of their Islamist flowering. They are where we used to be in the 14th, 15th century. Their religion started much later than ours, and they are now, some sections of the Islamic world are portray some phenomena similar to those Catholic Europe did in the 15th, 16th century. So how do you manage to bring together and to increase understanding between two religions, for example, which are at completely different stages in their development?
Well, this is a long issue, a topic which can bring us to be here for the next 4 hours, I assume, because unfortunately, I would say unfortunately, we have not the possibility to include the values, the religious values also in our debate. It is, we are talking about different and very specific kind of values in this panel, and maybe it's wrong. It should be actually the panel should be attended by somebody who can enlighten us more in the dialogue of religions, which is extremely important part of the discourse which might bring the world out of the crisis. So I see that we have some people here from representing a religion and a church, and I'm very pleased that you are here, and I'm sorry that we did not dedicate more time to these values. It would be correct to talk about it maybe more extensive. So, Professor Verinen.
Just 2 sentences on immigration. The fact is that 3% of the world's babies are born in the European Union, 3%. So there is a huge quantitative demographic imbalance, and also very different age profiles between the North and the South. And as a result of that, to my mind, multicultural society is not a choice, it's a necessity over the next 20 to 30 years.
Thank you. Please don't leave, don't abandon the hope. I am giving the word to you. May I have the mic? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Milagros Donna Ravallo. I'm Chargé d'Affaires of the Argentine Embassy in Vienna. My country is not that old as the country of Mr. Cassodas. We only have 200 years, but we have a lot of experiences with crisis, actually, and we have not gone down yet. We only have the highest percentage of psychoanalysts per capita in the world, so that might be also a solution. And we are a very successful example of immigration, so we can also teach a lot about that. My question is values and principles. Are we talking about 2 different concepts? Because I have been a diplomat for more than 30 years now, and I have worked very hard on a set of principles that we have reached through the international organizations, mainly in the UN, fundamental rights of mankind, the rights of children, human rights, social rights. Certainly we are looking at, we have to tackle down seriously the reform of the UN system because some of us, some of the countries in the UN system we're looking for a new, efficient, effective, and most of all transparent way of dealing with the relationships. But we do think that we have a set of values, a set of principles that we have to follow them. We have them, and they are not only Occidental or Western values, because almost 200 countries belong to the UN, and these conventions, these values, these principles that are set at universal values. So I think the idea that we have to look behind us and say, are we following these principles? Are we really working on them? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid I will disturb the pace of the conference if we don't stop now. I would like to thank you very much to all participants, our distinguished panelists, and everybody who was. You really showed the respect for the values by not choosing leisure instead of participating to our round table. I'm not able to make a summary of the debate. I think it makes no sense. We just reinforced the necessity to have the debate about the values as a part of general efforts and discourse about how to overcome the crisis. So we should come back to the values, and the values should be reminded independently of what the politicians are going to do in order to shorten the crisis. I heard that also in other panels the values were mentioned as a part of or as a core of the problem. So it is reaching from the respect for international law to the rule of law, human rights, and all other things which are generally perceived as a set of the values. So the values deserve to be recalled and to be based upon whatever solution and outcome of the crisis will be. So thank you very much for the kind participation.